I'm Stephanie Wilson, and you're listening to Freedom Over Fascism.
It was in 2020, for the presidential, of course. That's where I really upped the stakes, and I decided to make it more of a formal thing. And I was raising money for House and Senate and president, as well as some state legislative races, mostly in Michigan. And so for 2020, I was hoping to raise $250,000 total. And that seemed like a pretty lofty goal. And when the dust settled at the end of 2020, I had raised $6 million.
Hi, friends. Welcome back to Freedom Over Fascism. I'll start by paraphrasing Hillary Clinton from last Thursday. Anything going on last week? Of course, last week, Donald Trump was convicted on 34 felony counts of falsifying business records to conceal a sex scandal to interfere in the 2016 election. Here's the deal, though. We can't count on his being a felon to bring us victory this November. Nope, we have to go and talk to people outside our bubble, to people barely paying attention, even now. And what do we say? We say that Donald Trump was indicted by a grand jury of ordinary Americans and convicted by a jury of everyday Americans that his lawyers agreed to. He is a felon, full stop. It wasn't a hush money trial. It was an election interference trial. He cheated to win the 2016 election, which of course we already know, but now he's a felon because of it. We need to keep up the drumbeat of his criminality for people not following the news. We need to make sure not to talk about it as a hush money trial, because that minimizes it and makes it seem like a sexual scandal when it was, in fact, cheating to win a presidential election, in which his administration's policies around COVID led to 1 million Americans dying needlessly. He cheated to be able to sell our secrets to foreign governments. He cheated to try to extort Vladimir Zelensky. And he cheated to win in 2016 so he could try to overthrow the 2020 election, in which he also cheated, and stop the peaceful transfer of power. Today we'll hear from Charles Gaba, an ACA analyst from Michigan, who has raised a boatload of money for Dems since 2018. First, we talk about when I first interacted with him on Twitter, when I wondered aloud in very poor taste whether COVID death rates would change the electorate enough to change state-level races in red states. It was ghoulish, it was tasteless, and it was a question that followed easily from politicizing public health policy around COVID prevention, masks, vaccines, etc. Charles and I talked about those early COVID days, which will help you remind people you know about just how bad it was back then. We forget how scared we were, how many people were dying, and how so much could have been avoided with a government who made decisions based on best practices in public health rather than telling people to inject bleach. We went on to discuss his online fundraising, in which he has raised more than $330,000 this cycle for Dems in federal, state, and local races across all 50 states. Unfortunately, we had technical difficulties toward the end of our conversation. So at the end, you'll hear his fundraising stats in my voice, based on a tweet thread he wrote and forwarded to me last week. So please enjoy our conversation and go to blue24.org and donate to the candidates of your choice. Charles was certain to tell me that this is not a PAC and he doesn't take any money people give to candidates, that you can help support him on the website. This is something that any of us can do, and Charles makes it really easy to access candidates across the country. One last thing. Like always, I ask for your support for the podcast. I want to create more content, but I can't do that until some of you sign up to be paid subscribers. When I have enough content, I'll start making some of it available only to my paid subscribers. So please help to keep your content coming. You can subscribe at www.freedomoverfascism.us. Now for our conversation. Charles Gaba, welcome to Freedom Over Fascism.
Thank you for having me.
I'm so glad you're here because I have been a correspondent, if you will, with you on Twitter for at least 2 years. And a lot of our activists listeners might know you if they're active in pro-democracy Twitter. But others might be saying, who is this dude? So I just want to let them know that I first came across you when I was working for Heidi Beidinger, running for state legislature in Indiana. And by the way, she's running again. So listeners, please help her campaign. And I wondered aloud to the Twitter sphere what the effect of COVID would be at the state legislative level, because at that point we knew that red states, and particularly red areas, had, through their anti-vaxness, had more deaths. And little did I know that somebody had actually done the math on that. And I was pilloried by a far right-wing nut job publication. Your role in policy and activism is a lot bigger than that, obviously. You've been raising money online since at least 20. Your Twitter profile identifies you as healthcare analysis, activism, and snark, which I can totally get behind. Can you introduce yourself and tell us what you think is the most important thing about this moment and what people can do?
Sure. Yeah. So just a little backstory on the healthcare side. So I actually was a freelance website developer up until about 11 years ago, but I'm also a data hound and spreadsheet nerd. And so back in 2013, when the ACA, it'd been sucking all the oxygen out of the room politically for years, and there were all sorts of technical problems that were happening. It was a total technical meltdown. At the same time, Ted Cruz in the Senate was leading a government shutdown as well. So you had these two major things happening at the same time, and both of them were about the ACA. So I was just curious about, well, with all this fuss that's been spent on this, is anyone actually signing up? And of course, nobody knew because it was such a mess. So I decided to start doing some, just as a nerdy hobby thing, I decided to just start crowdsourcing just how many people were signing up. That's all it really was initially. It was a sideline. And long story short, eventually I became known as Obamacare Central because healthcare reporters from around the country, they were hungry for data and hungry for information, and the government wasn't telling them a whole lot. So they started coming to me, and one thing led to another. What was supposed to be a short-term hobby ended up becoming my career. So I started learning as much as I possibly could about the U.S. healthcare system, about health insurance, Medicare, Medicaid, the ACA, group coverage, everything, and launched a blog at acasignups.net is my main little plug there, acasignups.net. And so it's a little of everything. It's citizen journalist, data analysis, really all things healthcare related. I still focus primarily on the ACA, but I've also expanded my repertoire. I've learned from actual experts in the industry about how insurance works, how it doesn't work, the benefits and ups and downs. There's the argument about single payer and universal coverage and different types of coverage. And yeah, that's been my thing for 10 years now. I initially started over at Daily Kos, which I'm guessing a lot of your listeners probably are familiar with. It's one of, if not the largest online left-leaning progressive Democratic community. And so I had a small following there at the time. And initially that's where I was like posting my blog updates before I launched my own. But I've been a solid Democrat for many years, probably 20 plus years now. I didn't really get involved politically until really it was Howard Dean. I was one of the Deaniacs, as they were called back in 2003, 2004. I was a huge Howard Dean fan. He's the one who inspired me to get involved politically. And then so I stuck with it ever since. So that's been about 20 years now. I developed a larger following over the healthcare stuff, where it sounds like you came in. You mentioned this a couple of years ago in the midst of the COVID pandemic. And this, of course, was public health. And yeah, I started tracking COVID data. And initially, it was the case rates and tragic hospitalization rates and tragically the death rates and so on. And yeah, I started noticing some interesting trends that were starting to happen. And initially, I was reluctant or hesitant to start, trying to put a partisan finger on it, if you will, because that seemed a little crass. It seemed a little distasteful. But as the trends continued, and it just started becoming so blatantly obvious what was starting to happen, it just became impossible for me to ignore. And if you looked at over time, the initial surge, the first few months back in spring of 2020, March, April, May, it was Democrats because it was the urban centers, the major population
Right.
centers, because of population density and where they lived and so
Right.
on.
I'm in the Boston area, and there's one biotech conference that was a super spreader event here, and it had already been in Seattle and New York, and those were the places where.
So yeah, it was definitely, and sadly, that was pretty obvious to everyone, including people like, oh, say, Jared Kushner and Donald Trump, because the White House, they were pretty clear that they just didn't give a rat's. And there was a big story out of Vanity Fair. Catherine Embry later wrote a story about the inside pandemic response from the Trump White House. And it was just appalling that they basically were just openly admitting, well, it's only hitting it's hitting the Dem areas, who cares? But the thing is, that was the first few months. There's this massive spike in blue areas. But at the same time, you had small rural areas, which of course trend extremely conservative, very deep red, the Dakotas and Wyoming and so on, where they of course were not being hit yet, and they had months to prepare. This was coming, but they had, unlike New York, New Jersey, Seattle, Detroit, Chicago, the port cities, what have you, rural America, they had months to prepare for this, and I'm sure some did, but for the most part, their leadership seemed to do pretty much nothing. Or if they did it was basically resentful. I guess we got to do this. And what I found is that starting in July, people think, well, it was the vaccination policy. And that certainly put into overdrive when the vaccines came out, and Red America, Fox News, and GOP leadership basically took a stance of not vaccinating, which is insane. But it was actually earlier than that it started. What I found is that the death rate from COVID in red counties, red America, started surpassing blue America as early as July of 2020.
Wow.
It was 9 months before vaccinations became widely available, because basically it was the other mitigation methods, masking, social distancing, that sort of thing, that basically were just being blown off. And then when the vaccines started becoming widely available to everyone, that was when the divergence started becoming clear, that Democrats were getting that jab as soon as they could, and Republicans, like under 65, basically were just blowing it off.
Right.
And yeah, and then the rest is history, sadly.
I don't want to spend too much time on this because we've gotten
Sure.
a lot further, although it's part of the narrative understanding of the divergence of and the polarization among people in the different information ecospheres that had been in existence for a long time. But I'm in Boston, and I never saw anyone without a mask. Nobody was eating inside. Nobody was seeing their friends. And then we learned it was safer to be outside. And then people did things outside, even in the winter, deep winter. So when I was working with Heidi in Indiana at her launch, she said, masks are optional, which from my perspective was, okay, maybe a few people won't wear masks. She said, masks are optional, but we're public health friendly here. So if you want to wear a mask, you're welcome to. And I was like, that just made my mind explode, because here, okay, we're a center of biotech. We have really highly educated population. And so people believed in health care. In fact, the ACA started here under Mitt Romney. But it was such a different outlook. I remember listening to Andy Slavitt religiously in the beginning, because he's the only one getting out good information about COVID, and knowing that people just weren't paying that much attention, didn't think it was going to affect them, thought that it was a hoax or whatever, was really crazy. So moving past COVID, one of the things we talk a lot about here is the importance of running candidates everywhere on local and state levels, because we give up so many seats that we do not contest. And so talking about how it's important to contest seats, recruit candidates, support candidates. And what you're doing with fundraising is part of that, because it's the entire field that's important and not just a presidential election. Because when you're finally contesting a seat after years of not contesting it, there's people out there who will vote for you, and those votes will trickle up to the top of the ticket and reverse coattail. Can you tell me a little bit about how you got to the idea of fundraising and how you made your decisions in the first place, and then also how it's going?
Sure. I'm going to say this up front so I don't forget to say it later, which I will several times, I'm sure. If you're listeners, go to blue24.org. That's BLUE24.org. So that's just a website that I've set up. And I want to clarify, this is not a PAC. This is something I have to stress over and over. This is not a PAC. It's not an organization. It's just a repository of links to ActBlue pages to just make it simple for people to donate to Democratic candidates. I receive nothing from this. That's something else I need to clarify. I'm not making any money off of this. Or rather, none of the money that I raise is going to me. If people want to donate to me personally, they can, but none of the money that I raise goes to me. It all goes to the campaign. Yeah, basically, I really started back in 2018, just dabbling with it. Really, all it was that I discovered that ActBlue, which at this point, I think something like 90 to 95% of Democratic candidates at the federal, state, and in some cases, even local levels utilize the ActBlue platform for their fundraising. That's grown over time. It used to be a mishmash of, you had NGP and PayPal and whatever, Venmo, whatever online fundraising tools people had. But more and more, Blue has become the de facto default for Democratic candidates and campaigns. But they have a whole suite of tools that you can use. And the main one is that I found most useful is the Slate tool, which means that if you have an ActBlue account and you want to raise money for a candidate, you can create your own page to raise money for them, but you can also add a second candidate or a third or 5 or 10 or 20. You can add, as long as they have an active ActBlue account, you can slap together basically any Democratic candidates for any races. There's a few limitations, like judicial races. Sometimes they aren't allowed to be on the, because those are, in some states, those are nonpartisan races officially, that sort of thing. For the most part, any Democratic candidate running for any office, as long as they have an active account, you can just slap them on the same page and raise money for all those candidates at once. And if somebody donates $100 and there's 5 candidates, by default, it'll be split $20 a piece. But you can also go in and pick and choose. You can say, I want 50 to go to this one, 10 to go to that one. But I don't like these, or they don't need the money. So you can choose however you want. But once I learned about that tool and how easy it was to use, in 2018, during the midterms, I used that just to raise, I think it was maybe like $100,000, which is a lot of money, but it seemed like a lot of money to me, mostly for Michigan, because I'm here in Michigan, for Michigan legislative races, and as well as the Governor Gretchen Whitmer and the Michigan candidates, mostly.
Boy,
And
did that come to
was,
fruition.
Oh, yeah. We had a huge success in 2018 here in Michigan. And so it was in 2020, for the presidential, of course, that's where I really upped the stakes. And I started, I decided to make it more of a formal thing. And I was raising money for House and Senate and President, as well as some state legislative races, mostly in Michigan. And so for 2020, I was hoping to raise $250,000 total. And that seemed like a pretty lofty goal. And when the dust settled at the end of 2020, I had raised $6 million.
Oh my goodness. Wow.
Yeah. It was stunning. It really took off. And I was just promoting it just through Twitter at the time, because some of these other social media platforms didn't exist at the time, right? Everything was Twitter. And that's where I had the following. So that's where I was just promoting it there. And yeah, so I ended up raising like $6 million. The vast bulk of it, like 80% of it, was for U.S. Senate races, because that was the big thing at the time. We had already flipped the House in 2018. So it was all about the Senate and the White House. And people just were obsessed with flipping the Senate, understandably. And it was really after Ruth Bader Ginsburg passed away in mid-September, that fall, that's when people went absolutely berserk. I was raising like $10,000 an hour at one point.
Oh,
and
wow.
Almost all of it was going to the Senate races.
The time I was doing the Biden Digital Coalition, I was the Facebook lead. It was just a parallel digital effort. And the day after Ruth Bader Ginsburg died, there was a Facebook group that went from 0 to 600,000 people in the space of 48 hours.
And with good reason, because as we saw, it worked, but it was too late, essentially. We did flip the Senate, but they managed to squeeze in, we need the rest. And I learned a lot from that experience, what works, what doesn't work, and what the trends are, and what people's human nature, that sort of thing. In the 2022 midterms, I formalized it even more and tweaked it. And But again, it was the midterms. It's a very different tone. And of course, at that point, the Dems had a trifecta. It was a bare trifecta. It was by the skin of her teeth, but they had one. And plus, it was a midterm. So I ended up raising about 1.3 million, I think, during the midterms. And so for 2024, that's when I formalized even more. And I actually set up this website, again, blue24.org. And this time I'm going all out. In addition to having the site, so it's like a one-stop repository, I've set up pages not just for U.S. House, U.S. Senate, and scattered local races, but I have a page set up for every single state. I've got 50 pages for all 50 states. Some of them don't even have, like Maryland doesn't have legislative races this year, but I have a page. You can donate to the state party if you want. Same thing with Alabama and so on. But so yeah, I've got pages for all 50 state legislatures, as well as statewide races like governor, secretary of state, attorney general. I've got one for state Supreme Court races, one for U.S. House, one for U.S. Senate.
Right.
And yeah, so that's what I'm doing.
A 50-state strategy.
Yes.
Started by...
Yes, I've come full circle there, right?
So one of the things that is not controversial, but there are theories of give money to the swing state and the swing district because of how they are important in the very short term. And then the other, which is give money for power building in states because they got to start somewhere, right? Michigan took a long time to get where it did. Wisconsin took a long time. Georgia as well. I noticed more recently that you have more state party options. And I'm wondering what the response is when you ask for donations to state parties as opposed to candidates. How is that shaking out?
I've posted a few threads about this, about my philosophy here, and I'm trying to walk the tightrope here because, as you said, there's two schools of thought here. One is the more pragmatic, focus on the swing districts only. Those are the most important ones. Don't waste resources on these districts that nobody can win, right? And there are strong arguments to be made for that. We have limited resources. We have to allocate. We have to triage. And that is a valid argument. The flip side of that is, again, the 50-state strategy and leave no Dem behind. That if you abandon a red district or a red state, if you abandon it for too long, then eventually you're never going to be able to get it back, or it's going to be 10 times harder to get back, that sort of thing. Not to mention, you've got Dems, as you said, running in a tiny little blue dot in a red sea who are desperately trying, but they're not getting any support. And so I respect that. I respect them for putting their neck out and giving it the try. Plus, there's the fact that you have to look at the bigger picture that for a statewide race or even a larger district race, like maybe you're in a small state house district, but it's part of a larger congressional district. And your district may be deep red, but the district as a whole may be competitive. Or, of course, the state may be competitive. Every vote for you, hopefully, they're going to vote, as you said, the reverse coattail effect. That hopefully, they're going to vote for Dems up the ballot as well, those larger races. So maybe you're not going to win, but you'll help your congressional or Senate or governor candidate win. So it's like the sacrificial lamb kind of thing.
Right.
So there's strong arguments both ways. And I try to walk the line between those. My general rule of thumb is for statewide races, the U.S. Senate, governor, state Supreme Court, whatever, I include every purple state, right? But I also include every red state, no matter how deep red. I have Wyoming, Oklahoma, South Dakota, Alabama. If there's a statewide race, I throw them on the page and I list them. I have them separated. I'll say, well, here's like the most critical states. Here's the ones that are going to be tougher climbs, tougher races, tougher states. So I'll label them as such, but I still include them. And if people want to donate, they donate. I'm not going to dismiss someone who chooses to donate to, a candidate running in a deep red state. Because I assume at the state level, people are smart enough to know that Wyoming is a deep red state. And so if you donate there, the odds are that you're probably not going to win.
Right.
At the statewide level, I think that's reasonable to assume people know. So they have their own reasons. Maybe they just really love that candidate and they think that they want to encourage them to try again in the future. Maybe they're just trying to help build the state party, etc. For district level races, Congress and state legislature, that's where it becomes more of a problem, partly for practical reasons. There's just so many of them. There's over 7,000 state legislative districts plus Congress. So you're talking about like 7,500 districts. I'm doing this as a volunteer.
Right.
Right. So I don't have the time or the resources to go over every single district and say, well, this one's in a red area. Oh, but the local situation is, but it's a terrible Republican candidate and a great Democratic candidate, and there's some local issue. I don't have the time to vet every single aspect of that.
And that's where our technical difficulties ended the conversation. So I'll catch you up. I asked Charles what was so important about not being a PAC. He told me that he's researched some of the generic Democratic PACs with open secrets and the FEC. And some of them take approximately 70% of the funds they raise for overhead, more specifically for consultants and list acquisition. And they give 20 to 30% of the haul to the candidates themselves. Charles, on the other hand, takes no money from what he raises for candidates. At the time of this recording, around the 1st of June, here's how it's going. By the end of May 2020, Charles had raised $303,000 for Dems up and down the ballot. By the end of May 2024, he raised more than $573,000. He's also raised another $16,700 for other organizations, mostly Voters of Tomorrow, as well as abortion reproductive rights ballot initiatives in Arizona, Florida, and Montana. In 2024, there are 10 competitive Senate seats and 10 long shot seats. So far, nearly 80% has gone to the competitive seats. In other words, donations to competitive Senate races is up 40% so far. When this cycle started, Charles actually expected total fundraising to be down. Instead, so far, it's up nearly 90%. You can support Charles directly through the blue24.org website. Charles Gaba and other fundraisers are part of the way we can work to rebalance power in the country. Charles has a reach that many individual candidates don't have, and his work will help more candidates and more races as the election season goes on. Thank you for listening to Freedom Over Fascism. Subscribe wherever you listen to your podcast, and please drop us a rating or review on Apple Podcasts.
Hey, I'm Alok, the host of Build the Change, a brand new podcast from ActBlue about the people at the center of progress. Join us on a journey across the country as we uncover stories about the everyday folks working together to build something bigger than themselves, real change. You'll hear from students in Appalachia advocating for LGBTQ-friendly books in their communities, healthcare workers providing telehealth abortions across the country, immigrant farm workers fighting for their safety in the blazing sun, and candidates in states with razor-thin margins. Listen to Build the Change now, wherever you get your podcasts.